Well, George introduced me, but I wanted to stay with the theme and have cat pictures. So we've got my four-legged companions that are back in North Carolina, and the big cat in the middle helped a lot, as I wrote the DITA spec. I did not dye that cat. No, but he weighs 20 pounds. So, anyhow, just a quick look at what we'll go through here. And I think we've alluded at some of these points or touched on some of these points in other presentations. But this one, we're going to look very directly at who uses the DITA-OT. And by contrast, who supports the DITA-OT? Who performs the work? And really ask, how sustainable is this? And what sort of plan should we make moving forward to ensure that the DITA-OT project remains healthy, continues to develop, and to grow as the DITA Technical Committee rolls out new releases of DITA? So, is there anyone in this room who does not use the DITA Open Toolkit? One hand, two hands, okay? Obviously, we've got a huge number of people who use the DITA Open Toolkit simply because it's what their companies use to process their data source and to render output. We've got a large representation here of companies who actually include the DITA-OT in a product they ship, or their product really relies on it. And finally, we've got consultants who develop DITA-OT plugins or other products or training around it. I don't expect anybody to be able to read the names of the companies here. This is an image that comes from Kris and Roberts at Ixiasoft, and it's already out of date. I think there are more like 650 plus companies now using DITA, and of course that doesn't include the companies that do not want to disclose that they use DITA and the DITA Open Toolkit. Practically speaking, if companies are using DITA, the odds are pretty good they're using the DITA Open Toolkit. There is really only one alternative, and I've yet to meet people who use DITAC in production. But out of curiosity, how many here in the audience fall in the category of you're here because your company uses the DITA Open Toolkit to publish your data source to an output, and you're not with a vendor? Okay, maybe 20%? In contrast, we have the whole tooling, the vast number of tools that use the DITA-OT, authoring tools, CMS, delivery systems. How many of you here fall in the category of you work for a company that produces one of these applications? Okay, about the same number as end users. What about consultants? Okay, I'd say it's about the same mix of everybody. So overall, we really have a whole lot of companies that have a very, let's say, vested interest in the health of the DITA Open Toolkit. It publishes your content, it integrates into your products, it might be the core of the consulting services that you provide. Let's switch a little bit and change to the question of who supports the DITA Open Toolkit. And Robert alluded to some of the old days when there were dedicated test resources. Those days are over, they're gone, they vanished. They didn't last very long. Initially, when the DITA Open Toolkit was very first created, it was built together actually with the grammar files. And initially, IBM had dedicated resources that separated the two and create what became the DITA Open Toolkit. There's also support from Robert and Don Day, but that support really dwindled. And now I think it's fair to say that there's minimal development resources from IBM and no specific time allocations.
Yeah, over time it started off with a developer, like 1.5 developers to 2 developers in China, and then just very slowly trailed off until really it's basically me, and I support internal users of the toolkit in IBM, and as part of that, it wouldn't make sense for them to tell me support the toolkit but don't work on the toolkit, you know. But that means that I end up with sort of an unspecified time allocation. It's one of the many things that I do, and sometimes it takes more time, sometimes less, and so far I've been able to get away with that.
I think sometimes people have the idea that there is more solid institutional support behind the toolkit project than there is. And that really brings us to where we are now. And the reality is the work of the DITA Open Toolkit is happening through a very, very, very small group of largely individual contributors. It's essentially a hobby project. It's a little scary. We've just looked at the sheer number of companies who use the toolkit, and now we're going to look at the very small number of people that support it.
The JAWS theme over here to play in the background.
Yes. Thank you. It was actually a little bit of a challenge to try to think of, are there any metrics I can look at or I can present to you that would illustrate who's doing the work on the toolkit? And so I ended up compiling whatever I can. And we can look at, who attends meetings, who reports issues, what people respond to issues, who does the development work. And a lot of it is really encapsulated simply if you look at the commit numbers to our GitHub repositories. We've got 2 repositories, one for the source code, base source code, and one for the docs. And this is scary, guys. This is the result of commits over an 11-year time period. This is the top 10 contributors. And
I think the actual numbers it tracked only went back to something like 2012. The project's been around since 2005, so this doesn't track all the stuff from SourceForge before that, for example.
Do we just have these dates showing up? Have we added these dates?
I'm not sure. When I looked up
GitHub?
the commit list, GitHub told me I think it was since 2012.
Right, because GitHub didn't even exist.
Yeah.
Right, but I thought there was some way we imported data.
We imported a lot of data, but it did not track who did what in terms of commits, because there wasn't a connector.
Let me retract
so anyway,
this.
yes.
I'll change this slide. This is from 2000.
I told you I was here to heckle. I mean,
keep me straight. From 2012, 2013 to the present. But it is still, these numbers are a little scary. We have a small handful of people doing a lot of the work. And it's only 2 companies, IBM and Synchrosoft. I was a little distressed to find that I was in the top 10. Yes, Elliot.
You point out that you and Roger are primarily contributing to the documentation, which is important, but you separate code and docs.
And that's what our next slide will allude to, but that's still, even if this is just, if I'm up here just because of doc contributions, it's scary.
also, yeah, and when I reviewed a version of this a week ago, I suggested putting the star by Jarno. I don't think I deserve a star compared to that number, but
Well, I think you do in comparison to the other 8 of us up there. So,
point out as well that numbers, I mean, statistics, you can twist to say anything, and a commit, when you look at numbers like that with such a huge number, obviously Jarno's the standout. There's no question. He's basically running the show. For everything else, a commit can be a 1-line change in docs, or it can be, a huge new feature. So a commit is not always a reliable number, but it's one of the metrics we have.
But it is the only metric that we actually have. And Robert's right. I mean, this could represent a very small tweak to code or docs, or it could be a commit that is pulling in a feature that involves 100 hours of work.
I think Jarno maybe, or
Those are basically commit offers. So if you send a pull request and it's offered with your name, then
Right, yeah, because most of the people on that list don't have commit authority to the core repository, so it saves the original committer. That said, we do generally follow a policy of, squashing new features into a single commit. So it might represent a small tweak, it might represent a huge amount of work that shows up as one commit.
So regardless of the actual numbers, do look, though, at the fact that this is a very small group of people. And it also, certainly for the documentation, it does not reflect any of the work that happened in SourceForge. This is work that simply happened once we moved the documentation source to its own repository within GitHub.
The same with code. For about a 2-year period, Deborah Pickett was doing a ton of amazing work over at SourceForge, and none of that transferred over with this history. But it was still a small group.
So just to pick up, there are other ways that don't show up quite in the commit stats, where people on the toolkit team spend a whole lot of time handling issues, reading them, creating test files, checking to see whether a fix is shipped, responding to people's issues, explaining the resolution, looking at the backlog. And I want to give a special call out here to Eero and Radu, who really do a lot of work in this area. And it's very much behind the scenes work, but it's pretty critical. As I think you've heard by now, we do have monthly project calls, both for the main project and for the documentation. You've got a list here of companies that are represented and the individuals who have participated this year. Again, the same people, same companies. We did make a big push earlier this year at the North America conference to ask CMS vendors to attend. And so we've seen an upswing there. But what this really boils down to is we've got very little of any sort of institutional support. I want to, of course, also give a shout out here to the different companies that are sponsors of this event. You're not up here on the slide. I think that's pulled into the larger DITA-OT Day event, but we do really appreciate it. And finally, there's a lot of unofficial participation by people who post about the DITA Open Toolkit on DITA users and are generous in taking their time to respond to others. But I think we need to look at the question of how sustainable is this to have so much of our DITA universe and DITA tooling resting on a project that is sustained by such a small number of people. What happens if Yarno gets hit by the bus? Or Robert decides to play a full-time daddy and steps on a Lego, falls down the stairs?
My kids are still young enough that they use the Duplos. Those are fairly easy to avoid, but we'll be switching to Legos soon, and then I'm scared.
Roger might decide to teach Aikido full-time, and I might just get burned out and decide I don't want to do anything but cook. I think we're running on a little bit too slim of a foundation here, particularly for a project and a piece of software, the DITA Open Toolkit, that is pretty vital to our DITA ecosystem, if you will. It's vital digital infrastructure. And I think part of the challenge is to figure out how do we support it, how do we sustain it, how do we feed it, nurture it. And here's where I want to tie it into, I think, the larger context of it's just a bigger problem. We have aging digital infrastructure, and a lot of it is based around open source code. And the DITA Open Toolkit is one of these pieces of it. And like the physical infrastructure, it needs regular update and maintenance. And I think it's part of our challenge as a community of DITA users to figure out how we can make that happen. I want to credit this. This is by a really good white paper by Nadia Ejbal, published through the Ford Foundation, and I've got the link at the end. I'd urge everybody to take a look at this. So I read that white paper and I thought, well, how do non-digital infrastructure projects get funded? Well, we've got roads, sewer systems, power, things that are normally operated by governments and utility companies. That funding for that usually comes from taxes. That doesn't really work for us. We've got civic and cultural institutions where usually people give tax-deductible donations or their philanthropic grants. We've got churches. They tend to be funded by tithes from members. And this is about at the point where Robert and I got a little punchy and started thinking of the Church of DITA and and yes, Yarno is infallible.
He was dogmatic.
But one thing was sort of abundantly clear. All of these, examples or things I was just talking about do revolve around funding. And one of the things that people here might not really be aware of, the DITA-OT project has no legal entity. It has no bank account. It has no legal structure. We have no way for people to contribute financially if they would want to, as an individual or as a company. And that's caused us problems over the years. The first year that we had DITA-OT Day here, Robert Anderson paid out of his own pocket to come here. There were, participating companies that would have happily picked up his costs, but the only way that could have been done with IBM's blessing, if it could have been going through a nonprofit type organization, not one of the companies that produces products.
For some reason, our HR wasn't really happy when I said, hey, can some of these vendors we might buy things from pay for my way over there? I still don't understand that.
So, if we had a legal entity, we could buy the occasional plane ticket, we could take contributions, and we might consider being able to fund some development efforts. We might be able to fund some efforts that would help us have a more diverse project team. I don't know if you've noticed, I hope you have, but I'm the only woman active in the DITA Open Toolkit project currently, and we're all white. It would be nice to have a little more diversity. So, a couple of thoughts here about moving forward, and hopefully, we can fold in discussion of this, carry over into the panel. But we very much need to move forward and look at forming some sort of legal entity. And I think the place to start there is to look at foundations and groups that currently support other open source projects. And taking off the DITA-OT hat and putting on the DITA-TC hat, I think one very useful thing might be to consider a foundation that could support both DITA the standard and DITA the open toolkit. I don't have enough time or resources to work on two foundations. That's not going to work. Other things that I think we really need to do is raise more awareness about the role that DITA-OT plays as infrastructure. I've mentioned that I think we really need to expand the pool of contributors and, of course, value non-code contributions, whether community, documentation, evangelism. But one of the things we really need, and we also don't have, is any metrics about the DITA-OT usage or the economic impact of the DITA-OT. We have no idea how many companies use it. Are they satisfied? Are there pain points? And if you sometimes think that the toolkit team isn't listening to you or we're getting things wrong, we might be developing in too much of a vacuum. The other thing that would be very helpful for us to have a better handle on is just what sort of economic impact does a toolkit have? What's its financial value? How much money do companies make from it? And if it didn't exist, or if development on it ceased, how much would that cost companies? And this is where I'm out of my realm of expertise. I don't really have any business analyst skills, but are there ways we could compute or develop this information? And I'd really encourage any of you who might have skills or training in this area, please come talk to me. So I want to try to just close with concrete things that we want to ask people for. And if you're a vendor or a consulting firm, we really want more participation. As George said, this is your project too. It's not just our code that you pick up and use. We need more involvement. We really need people to attend the contributor meetings, to try out the development code and provide feedback. Just don't wait until things break with it. And consider how you might make a contribution, or if there are ways you might sponsor other events like this, or actually sponsor time, concrete time from one of your employees to the toolkit. For individuals, if you customize a toolkit, please come and participate in the project. And if you don't, ask your vendors, ask your consultants to participate. If your vendor or consultant says that there's a bug in the DITA-OT toolkit, here's how to fix it, ask them if they've reported the issue. We do not get very many issues reported at all by folks who pick up and use the toolkit. I know a lot of things get fixed. If you've got technical writing skills, the documentation team could need you. And again, the project management, the business analyst skills that I referred to. These are some of the new things we're really putting on our list of ways we need help and participation. But again, we need help to develop some of these metrics and statistics about usage and economic impact. And to help us with investigating ways in which we have more solid support from companies, not just individuals, and perhaps a legal entity to stand under the toolkit.
And when you talk about more people coming to the contributor calls, if you think, well, I'm not a developer, my opinion might not matter at these calls. We've had people start attending from Vassant and Astoria recently when I reached out to some of the CMS vendors to come. And if you were listening during my localization or internationalization talk earlier and you're still awake now, well, first off, congratulations. But second, I mentioned that I had been informed recently that my expectation on how generated strings are used in other languages was inaccurate. That's just because I had these assumptions I've always had that we have these strings in there, we in IBM use them, why wouldn't other people use them? And it was somebody on one of these calls that just said, like, oh, wait, you have those IBM blinders on. This isn't how most people do it. Most people retranslate those. Little things like that. Things that, because I live in a bubble, we all live in some sort of bubble. We need people from other bubbles to come and participate.
Any questions, thoughts, or comments?
I've got several thoughts and comments. One is that So hi, Christoph from, I'm kind of a weird duck here because I don't use the Open Toolkit. I'm interested in it because it's an open source project
Right.
that is doing documentation. And we are doing documentation, but we've played a little bit with the toolkit, but not much more. But the way that I can help is that I do live in the open source world. So, and this is a very common problem that we have all the time. So, and I've seen several organizations address it to, sometimes better than others. There's a few very practical tips that I think I can share. First of all, I think we should have a code sprint for the Open Toolkit, because the most important way to get people involved, like stepping on a phone call, can be daunting, especially if it's like a few people that's going to be there and you're going to be talking with the luminaries of the project. So it might be easier to like get to know the people, and if there's like a code sprint where you can contribute like half a day or a day, doing some docs, and the people that are involved in the project are there who can show how it works. It's kind of like you get some training because you learn how to use the Open Toolkit and contribute to it. And at the same time, you contribute some time and get involved and see how much fun it is. And
Okay, I hear you.
Yeah.
You're saying come up with some concrete ways in which people can participate other than jumping into the regular calls. I think the idea of a doc sprint might work. I would also be very interested to hear maybe later any tips you have, and in particular, ways people who have failed.
Yeah, okay.
What are the things you really don't want to do?
There's a lot of blog posts in our community. Second, I wouldn't necessarily jump straight to a separate organization, because that will add a lot of overhead. You'll have to start managing it and so on. There's a new friend who is doing a fiscal sponsorship organization here in Germany, and basically they help open source projects with this problem. They have a bank account.
Well, at this point, I'm sort of saying, let's investigate this. So I think there are a number of different paths we can take to follow that.
So I can introduce you to that guy, and then the thing about, I think that the key issue is that this is a platform. DITA Open Toolkit is a platform, and it's being used as a platform by all the vendors that built stuff on top of it, and the platform has been overtaken by the vendors. And there's a really interesting book about this called Platform Revolution, which talks about how to make a successful platform and how to make sure that it remains the platform and doesn't get overtaken by.
Thank you, Christoph. I know we had some other hands. Ray?
Can I also just add one really quick comment about being intimidated on the phone call? We're all code developers who spend most of our days staring at our shoes when we haven't, hyped ourselves up on whatever we took to get it through today. Please don't be intimidated. We're scared of you as you are. We are as scared of you as you are of us.
Kris, when you put up the sort of ways in which infrastructure gets financed, I think what was on the slide was pretty US biased. There are other models. For example, here in Europe, there is in fact direct state intervention in things like culture and so on. And certainly in terms of infrastructure, and if we take the point of view that this is an infrastructure project and an infrastructure idea, then you can start to look at either state involvement or semi-official involvement. There are ways to get European Union support. In the US, you can go for things like the National Science Foundation, or maybe if you don't want to go quite that big, something smaller but related. The question is, and it's a bit what Kris raised just a moment ago, how institutional do you want to get? How much overhead do you want to develop? Do you need a paid full-time person to administer this? How much is that going to siphon off from the actual revenue, usable revenue, and so on? These are all questions that need to be investigated, obviously, but there are solutions.
Thanks, Ray. I appreciate being directed away from my own U.S. biases.
This is Elliot. I was just going to say, as one of the consultants who contributes, I've been fairly successful in getting clients to fund contributions that are either to the Open Toolkit or to plugins that work with it, and funding that work so that I'm not doing everything in my basement on weekends. And it can't just be the power of my personality and position in the DITA community. So it must be possible for other consultants to get similar sort of success, just really by asking, just saying, will you let me put this into open source? And they're like, okay.
Other comments, questions, thoughts?
We've only got about 30 minutes left before we're kicked out, I think. Is that right? So if we're going to do a panel, which I don't know how much people really cry out for a panel, we sort of put it there by default. But if we're going to do that, we should probably start getting the few of us up there so we can dance.